Welcome back. This is week 3, lecture 1, The English Civil Wars and Thomas Hobbes, English Absolutism. And with this lecture, we find the beginning of the course, at least according to the textbook. Um, we have been, the past 2 weeks, going through the background from medieval Christendom through the Reformation, the transition from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state, and seeing some of those processes and the political context of really a shift in paradigm that then historians refer to as early modern Europe in various ways. It doesn't mean that all historians refer to this shift in paradigm or the myth of Christendom and the myth of the nation state, but the emergence of early modern Europe from medieval Europe. Is a more general, most basic, most bland understanding. I've tried to give more conceptual structure to that in terms of the myth of Christendom and the myth of the nation state. And we really begin to see the foundations for what will come throughout here into modern Europe and all up until our modern day in so many ways. And the English Civil War is a major development. Now, the term the English Civil War is somewhat problematic and misleading because there were a number of skirmishes, and historians have been more precise, and they have identified 3 civil wars: the First English Civil War, the Second English Civil War, the Third English Civil War. And some of these wars have also different names, like the Third Civil War is also called the Anglo-Scottish War. For this course and for this purpose, you can think of it as just simply the English Civil War, as long as you realize that there are various phases and stages and battles and skirmishes that comprise this civil war. In some ways, all wars are like that when you go down into the particulars. But here, especially, what I want you to know is that from approximately 1642 to 1653, anyway, there's a period of civil war. Tensions are flaring, and we're talking about England, Scotland, and Ireland, which I'll be talking a little bit more about as we go along. And this is in this context of not so much a crisis like the Middle Ages, but of conflict and tensions, because something is new is coming up. And how do we deal with this? I think I mentioned one of the problems with this transition was that within medieval Christendom, at least, the structures of authority were set, even though there's competition and battles and all kinds of problems over that authority. The basic structure was there. But then what happens with the crumbling of Christendom, as I refer to it, in this transition, is new forms of authority have to be established, and that becomes the nation state. Whether we're talking about the individual principalities within the empire that then led to the 30 Years' War and the conflicts over that, or the Kingdom of France and the monarchy in France, or then England or Spain or what have you, took the reins of being the determinate authority for the territory, for the state, even though there still remains conflict involved. So we're talking about a very abstract level and a very practical level. And the 17th century is often referred to, among other things, as the age of absolutism. I think I've maybe indicated previously that we still, though, have absolutism in medieval Christendom. The Pope was seen as, or proclaimed himself as an absolute ruler. The Emperor also proclaimed himself as an absolute ruler, ruling for God. It gets to be a real mess. So what makes absolutism in the 17th century different from various assertions of absolute rule and divine right to rule that had come previously? Those are some of the questions we need to look at and answer, or try to, in any case. And in some ways, this lecture and the next lecture, dealing with French absolutism, will put that together, because the theories of absolutism that we see with France and England are very different, even if they both culminate in the position of the monarch being an absolute ruler by divine right. In some ways, English absolutism is built on a theory from bottom up, which we'll talk about in a minute and what I mean by that. Whereas French absolutism is very much a top-down model of absolutism. Now, when I say bottom up, in terms of the theory of absolutism, I'll be talking when I get there about Thomas Hobbes, because that's how he constructs his theory of the absolute state. He doesn't appeal immediately to divine authority going down. He argues that it is a process kind of from the bottom, or what he refers to as the state of nature, culminating in the absolute state. I'll be getting to that when I get there. But he developed his theories in context of civil war. When England was being pulled apart, and we've talked about the civil wars with the League of Schmalkalden and the Empire, leading up to and culminating in and being resolved by the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Even though that led to the 30 Years' War, new outbreak, some 50, 60 years later, in 1648, with the onset of the 30 Years' War, culminated then in the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Well, the 30 Years' War is kind of going on. Civil war in England is breaking out. And just as France had gone through their so-called French wars of religion, which were civil war in France between the Huguenots, or the French Calvinists, and the crown, the monarchy, and the Catholic faction, which then is resolved, so to speak, with the Edict of Nantes in 1598 with Henry IV, his conversion back to Catholicism, and on we go, even though then there are tensions that will be breaking out there too, but we'll see that development in the next lecture. But here we start then back with Elizabeth I and the Elizabethan settlement, which I've talked about briefly in the last lecture or the one before. In terms of the Reformation in England, now we need to look at the impact and the consequences of this so-called settlement, because it certainly didn't settle things once and for all. And when Elizabeth dies in 1603, tensions break out once again. So that's what I want to kind of frame all of this lecture in terms of the course. This is kind of where the textbook starts. And so this is trying to put that in the background, the context, and where do we go from here? And that will be then the basis for the rest of this course. So having said that, hopefully putting this all in context of what we've done already and what we're going to be doing now and where we're going, picking up the beginning of the textbook this week, we'll go from there. Now, you have two readings for this week. One is source readings, as well as the textbook readings. Source readings, one is Cardinal Richelieu's statement, which I'll be talking about next lecture, week 3, lecture 2, talking about French absolutism. And then for this lecture, it's kind of funny because the reading is not an illustration of absolutism, but actually the opposition to it, the Petition of Right of 1628. I'll be talking about that when we get there. It is the assertion of rights of the English. It's been seen as an important document. And if you look at your final essay in the final exam, the issue of human rights is a central focus of the course. And this is one of the earliest, I'm not going to say it's the earliest, but it's one of the very earliest documents that is asserting rights. And it refers back to the Magna Carta, and I'll get there when I get there. It's not the same as individual inalienable human rights, but it's an important document in the development of rights over against the right of the monarch. And the absolute state, the absolute monarchy, was basically saying we're the only, I as monarch, if I am Louis XIV or James I of England, as I'll get there, I am the one with all the rights. No one else has any rights but me, unless I grant them rights. So that's some of the tension that's going on for understanding this beginning emergence and development of human rights, which is, again, the focus of this course. That's why that will be there. We'll get there when we get there. That being said, then we can proceed and go to the first slide here, setting the stage for the English Civil Wars in Thomas Hobbes, and that is to go back to the religio politics of Elizabeth I. Even though I went through the English Reformation somewhat briefly or precursorily, I just want to remind you of the general nature of the English Church. There were, even in the 14th century, there were rights and privileges granted to the English, as there were to the French, by the Pope to kind of govern things themselves. And so there was a concept of the English Church, the French Church, that was sanctioned by the papacy to allow them to kind of deal with ecclesiastical affairs within their own territories. That was one of the problems with the empire. No such grants of privileges had been given. And that then, with Luther and everything else, that contributes to the issue of the German princes demanding that Charles V deal with the Luther question on German soil and go from there. So that's kind of that is set. And Henry VIII was a fierce defender of the papacy and wrote against Luther and received the title Defender of the Faith. That was an important stage. And then his problems with his lack of an heir led to finally the Act of Supremacy in 1534, proclaiming Henry the head of the church, breaking from Rome, even though they didn't break from much else in terms of except for the authority of the Pope. And I already think I've gone through those issues. But then in the course of the later 1530s, beginning earlier in 1530s with the birth of Henry's son, Edward, who was raised and taught by Calvinist advisors of Henry, or at least advisors who were very much influenced by Calvinist ideas as they were coming into England. Edward was more of a Calvinist, a Reformed, so far more Protestant than was Henry. And when Edward came to the throne in 1548, after the death of his father, he instituted a lot of changes in the English church that caused some issues and problems, at least among the traditional Anglicans. And Anglican just means the English. The Anglican Church became known as, or the English Church became known as the Anglican Church. And so it became far more Calvinistic. So very much a change in ritual, a change in liturgy, a change in the Mass. As a lot of these changes are changes that really affect people in terms of tradition. But even though Edward didn't live that long, only for 5 years before he dies, the increasing influence of Calvinist doctrine, Calvinist positions became very strong and became embedded. And so after Edward dies in 1553, when then Mary Tudor, Henry the first child, Mary, comes to the throne, it is she wants to return to Catholicism. And then she also arranges a marriage with Philip of Spain, Charles V's son. And that upset a lot of the English on a number of reasons, because whereas the Spanish and the English had been close allies under Henry VIII, with the idea that the heir of Henry and Catherine would be the inheritor of all the Habsburg territories in the empire, as well as in England, that fell apart. So there's animosity. Mary tries to go back to the status quo ante, so to speak, and marries Philip. But then that doesn't work out, as I think I said. And then when Mary dies in 1558, also childless, Elizabeth comes to the throne. Elizabeth as Henry VIII's second daughter of Anne Boleyn. And Elizabeth was more Catholic or more Anglican than Mary, but not as Calvinistic as Edward. And she has the problem of what to do with all of this and what to do with the Spain problem, because as Elizabeth is coming to the throne, Philip II says, I have a right to the throne of England because I am the husband of Mary, the Queen. So, but the English nobles are no way in hell, especially the more Calvinistic factions. So there's this political tensions between Spain and England, what to do about it all, how does it all fit together, which is tied hand in hand with the religious question. within the greater religio-politics of Europe at this time. I'm going to stop referring to it as Christendom. And from this point on, I'm going to be talking about Christendom simply, if I ever do, as wherever Christianity is practiced, which is kind of the way we use it today, not in that more technical sense of Christendom as the myth of Christendom, referring to medieval Europe. So, what do we do about all this? And Elizabeth has to come up with a solution. Her settlement, the Elizabethan Compromise, was to then return the church to be more Calvinistic or Protestant than it was with Mary, but not as far as it was under Henry. And so, more Catholic, quote unquote, Rome or Roman, because Catholic simply means universal. They all appeal to being Catholic, but more Roman than it was under Edward, but more Protestant than it was under Mary or Henry. And a compromise never settles anybody or satisfies anybody. Now the problem that Elizabeth faced too was that the Catholic factions, the factions among the nobility that liked Mary and wanted to go back to obedience to Rome, were allied with Spain. So Elizabeth is like, no way in hell are we going to allow English sovereignty to be given up to Spain. We have to make sure that we prevent that claim that Philip is making. After all, there are rivals, especially in light of colonialization that is really heating up, and the English are beginning to get into it as well, as the Spanish already had been. And so this is almost a global political maneuvering on Elizabeth's part, and certainly to not allow Spanish influence on English policies. And in fact, English policy being to oppose Spain, both within Europe and then in the competition for colonial possessions and wealth overseas. So it's a mess. It's a mess. And Elizabeth said, okay, we're not going to allow Roman Catholicism. And here I'm using the term specifically, Roman Catholicism, because it's only in the context of what was going on in Europe, the so-called Reformation, the Council of Trent, the splitting up of Christendom, that we can begin to talk about Roman Catholicism as, let's say, another denomination of Christianity. We're not going to allow Roman Catholicism. We're not maybe going to actively persecute it like Mary. We're not going to try to round people up like Mary did with the Protestants, but it's not going to be tolerated. So Roman Catholic practice went underground in England. There were, noble estates that then had hidden secret chapels and had priests who would come and celebrate Mass for them. But if they got caught, they were persecuted and condemned. I went to one of these estates when I was in England, living and teaching there at Liverpool. It was amazing because they had to have lookouts to see if there were any royal troops in the neighborhoods that might hear them celebrating Mass, or might find out that they were celebrating Mass, and then they were likely to be persecuted and executed as not just heretics, but as there's a great word. What is it? It's not blasphemy. I've been having a hard time this morning coming up with terms I know very, very well. This is a term, when it does pop back into my head, you'll say, oh, you couldn't remember that, of course. Traitors. They were traitors to the state. That was it. Traitors. I couldn't remember traitors for some reason. They were traitors to the state because Catholicism and the practice of Roman Catholicism was seen as supporting Spain against the crown. That was what was going on there. So Elizabeth has this balancing act. She also has the problem of providing an heir. She knows that's an issue. She's been called a virgin queen because she never married. It's we can talk about that all we want, but the point is, whether she was actually a virgin or not, she warded off suitors and did not marry because she did not want to give up authority and power. If she married one of the leading English nobles, she knew that person then would be acting as king. She didn't want that to happen. She certainly wasn't going to form an alliance with a foreigner. So she was in this very tricky situation. And again, I think I said that she was one of the most outstanding monarchs of the period. Now, she dies in 1603. And I've already spent too much time on the background, which I've sort of already covered, but just to remind you of that. So where we're going in 1603, with no heir, who comes to the throne? Um, James VI of Scotland. James VI of Scotland. Now, before I move on to James 1:6, Charles I and the Puritans on the slide, this is still back on the second slide. We have Elizabethan persecution of Catholics, but here too we have the threat of the Presbyterians under Elizabeth. Because even though the Catholics for Elizabeth were potential traitors, she felt the more Protestant Calvinistic faction in her country, in her government, were undermining of her authority. And so she was very wary of this Calvinist influence as well. So the whole Anglican position, we have the Royal Anglican position, and then we have the what's called the Presbyterian position or the Calvinist position, and then we have the Roman Catholic factions. And Elizabeth has to balance all of them. Now, why would she consider the Calvinists or the Presbyterians to be undermining? Well, they were, because they were not so much royalists. They were more parliamentarian, referred to as the Presbyterians. Presbyter was just a Latin term for priest. So they're more local. And we talked about the organization of Geneva with the company of pastors and the small council. Even though Calvin ruled with authority, it was more charismatic authority, not necessarily institutional authority. And Geneva still was seen as a city-state and as a republic. And the Presbyterian form of government was just that, with the pastors, the elders, the teachers, and the deacons. There wasn't, within the Presbyterian church structure, the Calvinist church structure, there wasn't a monarch like there was with Roman Catholicism, with the papacy. There weren't bishops. There were not bishops in the Presbyterian Calvinist tradition, culminating in the Archbishop of Canterbury in England as the primate. This we call the primate, not the monkey primate in terms of humanoid development, but primate means the head priest in England. That didn't exist within the Calvinist tradition. Now, the whole point of this then too is that Calvinism became a predominant strength in Scotland because of John Knox. John Knox had gone to Geneva. He called it the most godly city he'd ever seen. And he then becomes the reformer of Scotland. He was a nasty little man, but that's a whole other issue in some ways. He was fiercely opposed to Elizabeth, fiercely opposed to women. And that was known at the time. So he wrote, very vicious, vile treatises against Elizabeth and against women's rule. But he then made a significant faction of Scotland Presbyterian or Calvinistic. Now, just as a footnote, today there is the Presbyterian Church, which comes from the Scottish Church. We also have then in this country a Calvinist tradition, or two or three, because they split up, coming from the influence of Calvin's doctrines in the Netherlands. The Dutch, it's called Dutch Reformed, the Reformed tradition. Both stem from Calvin. So the Scottish faction of it, referred to as the Presbyterians, the kind of Dutch faction of it is referred to as Reformed. We have Christian Reformed, we have Dutch Reformed, we have the whatever here in this country. So that's, if I talk about Presbyterian as being Calvinistic, it doesn't mean that all Calvinist traditions were subsumed under that term. But in Scotland, that's what it was. and the Church of Scotland became more or less a Presbyterian type of church. Elizabeth is wary of that. Why? Because again, it's more based on a quote unquote democratic structure. There aren't bishops. It's a non-episcopal church structure. And the Church of England was very hierarchical in terms of the church structure. And so a position that would undermine a hierarchy in terms of government was a threat, and we were wary of it. And so any kind of Calvinist influence for Elizabeth was a potential threat, not so much traitorous as with Spain and the Roman Catholic faction, but still had to be checked. So England is then caught at the death of Elizabeth in 1603 between the Anglican Center Elizabethan Settlements faction, the Roman Catholic faction that is then illegal essentially because if it's found out, it will be exterminated as heresy and as treason, and then the Presbyterian or the Calvinist faction as undermining the authority of the monarchy. Those tensions were still there when Elizabeth dies in 1603 and is succeeded by James Stuart, because Elizabeth was the last Tudor. I'm not going to go into the whole genealogy of why the Stuarts were heirs to the throne. It goes back to Henry VII, the father of Henry VIII, and one of his daughters had married a Stuart, and Mary is called Mary, Queen of Scots, was a cousin of Elizabeth. Certainly tensions there. And James was the offspring of Mary, Queen of Scots. So it's that kind of aspects. And there was also a relationship with the Medici and the French. And so we have kind of this French Stuart connection, with French being Catholic. And we have then also with Scotland being Presbyterian. So we have almost the two opposing factions to the Elizabethan settlement combined in James Stuart, who had become King of Scotland in 1567 when he's like 10 months old. He had a number of regents until I think it was in 1578, he becomes into his majority, not majority in terms of what we think of being 18, but he could rule on his own beginning in, so to speak, in 1578. And he is James VI of Scotland. That's where you get the 6-1 or the 1-6, because he's first James VI. 1603, he then is the heir to the English throne. So he becomes King James I of England. And Ireland was also then part of that dynamic. That gets into also problematic territories, but was King of England and Lord of Ireland. And James so becomes actually the inheritor of all three kingdoms: the Kingdom of England, the Kingdom of Ireland, and the Kingdom of Scotland. How does he handle things? And what really needs to happen for him to hold on to authority and power? Now, I have it there here. The reign of James of 1-6. This is in the rise of the Puritans, which is slide 3. And the rise of the Puritans refers to a faction of the Presbyterian faction within the Elizabethan church. Because with the Elizabethan settlement, I think I've already mentioned this, and with her tensions and distrust of the Presbyterians, some Presbyterians were supportive of Elizabeth. Others said, no, she's not going far enough. We need to continue to purify the Church of England. Those who argued for purifying the Church of England meant to rid the Church of England even more from anything that sniffed of or smelled of or even whiffed of Roman Catholicism. And so this attempt to purify the Anglican Church, to make it more Presbyterian, to make it more Calvinistic, that faction within the Presbyterian faction became known as the Puritans. And so we have the importance of the Puritans kind of as this more radicalized faction of the Presbyterians, and we have then this tension between the Roman Catholic faction, the Anglican center, and then the kind of somewhat split Presbyterian faction, always being a threat. And James 1:6 of Scotland, which was then a kind of a Presbyterian institution with a strong Calvinist um, presence in Scotland, but one that James never accepted. Because if he's going to ally with one side or the other, he's definitely going to be Anglican, Episcopal, if not then even moving a little bit towards the Roman Catholic position because of this alliance with the Stuarts and the French. It gets very messed up. What is James going to do? He's not sure. He has to somehow handle all these different factions. There's tensions with Parliament. They're worried about James's attempts to tip the balance that seemingly Elizabeth had more towards the Roman faction. Because even though the Anglican center was wary of the Presbyterian faction, especially the Puritans, it was more concerned with the Roman Catholic faction and its backing with Spain. And they wanted to make sure that they were like checks on James that he wouldn't go too far. And James starts portraying himself as an absolute ruler. He's the monarch. He has the authority. Now, he is trying to subdue Scotland. He tries to impose a more Anglican or Episcopal structure on the church in Scotland to resistance. But James 2 is the one I have up there, the King James Version of the Bible. It says, we are going to standardize religion throughout my realm, which is England, Scotland, and Ireland. And so he had this translation of the King James Version of the Bible, which he then tried to impose throughout, also based on opposition. So